We don't teach reading to train up for poets and writers. We teach it
Mhm.
because it's a basic skill. And we should be teaching drawing because it's basic to thinking.
Exactly 40 years ago, a book was published that has changed the way that the world thinks about drawing. Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain by Betty Edwards revolutionized the field of art education. I am so happy to welcome the author of this paradigm-shifting book, Betty Edwards, to speak with me today about learning to draw, the value of art, and the future of art education. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today, Betty.
Oh, you're welcome, Jessica. I'm really happy to be here with you.
Well, thank you. You wrote Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain almost in the same moment that neuroscientists were just beginning to understand the workings of the brain back in 1979. So nowadays, they're saying that there's no moment when our brain is only working on the left or right side. But your insight into the left brain mode or the right brain mode is absolutely the most powerful metaphor that I have ever used in my classroom to help beginning artists learn to draw. It just works. So I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit about the R mode and the L mode, the right and the left side of the brain.
Well, there is a lot of criticism of the ideas of right and left brain going around now. But the fact is, the original research in the 1960s is still there and has never been disputed. The brain is always working both sides together. There's no doubt about that. But the two hemispheres are, in fact, specialized for different modes of thinking. And that remains today. So the left brain, essentially, is verbal, analytic, really sequential, doing things one thing at a time. And the right hemisphere is visual, spatial, perceptual, relational, all of that going on in the right hemisphere. Now, of course, some brains, maybe 10% or so, left-handers, the organization is a bit different, but essentially the brain is asymmetrical, each side having its own jobs to do.
Well, and I know I certainly feel it whenever I have been drawing or painting and get completely
Yes,
lost in,
absolutely,
you know,
right.
losing what track of time it is. And it's interesting too. I notice when I'm teaching, often I'll be up at the board and I'll be in the middle of a sentence, and just when I'm starting to draw, the words just leave my mind because
Oh,
I'm
that's interesting. Yeah,
drawing. So
I've had that experience over and over. Yes, exactly.
So, what do you think are some of the skills or some of the special insights that an individual can gain whenever they specifically train the right side of their brain by learning to draw?
Um, what is gained, actually, is an insight into how things are put together as a whole. The left brain tends to take one thing at a time, one step at a time. It's essentially a linear system. First things first, second things second, and so on. Right hemisphere, using words. Words are essential. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, sees things all at once, sees how things work together, fit together, is able to um, think about how that combination is going to work out in the end. And this kind of thinking makes for a person with um, foresight and
Mm.
insight, all of those words in our language that indicate what the right hemisphere is doing for us. So it's important that, in my view, that we should be training up the right hemisphere in the way that we train up the left hemisphere through the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic, and logical thought, so on. And in my view, drawing is teaching kids how to draw, is the twin of teaching kids how to read. And we're not doing that. We're doing less and less of it all the time, and especially in America. And as a result, our students, the reputation of our educational system is crashing. There are, I think, 15 countries that are ahead of us in terms of educational achievement. Now, whether they're teaching right hemisphere skills, I don't know, but something is going on in our education. Emphasis on reading, writing, and arithmetic, emphasis on testing, endless testing, which is a left brain system.
Absolutely.
Not doing well for us. So my thought is to reinstate the arts, not to train up artists because our culture doesn't support them anyway,
Unfortunately.
But to train up, just as we train up the left hemisphere, to train up the right hemisphere and to have that powerful, and it is powerful, system to combine with our verbal systems.
Absolutely. So we'd add another R to the 3 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic, and the right side of the brain.
Right. The thing is that kids love to learn to draw anyway. There is a great wish among young kids, about 7 or 8 or 9, to learn to draw. And we just bypass that whole system, and continue to emphasize verbal systems.
Mm-hmm. I think something that you just brought to mind is we're losing that creative problem-solving thinking that once was an American staple, that people thought of America as the innovators, and to have that moment of seeing the big picture all at once and having an aha moment and inventive way of thinking, that is being lost as we try and compete against other countries that are specifically, I'm thinking of China, for example, that just is able to drill on those standardized tests. And we're competing on something that wasn't necessarily what made us such a special country in the beginning. So
it's so true. Right. Very well put, Jessica. When I was in school as a young kid, eons ago, it seems, we had classes in cooking, in gardening, all sorts of right hemisphere kinds of things. We did art. In my 4th grade, I remember we built an entire astronomical system with a dome with all of the constellations, and then pictures of the Greek gods and so on. So it was an entirely different thing. Now it's all language and testing, I'm afraid.
Well, and yes, I actually left the public school system myself after being an art and gardening teacher because of the emphasis on testing. And it's so unfortunate because, just as you mentioned with your experience in 4th grade, by teaching through the arts, you are able to touch on other subjects such as the Greek mythology, the history there, the stories, and how wonderful it would be if we got away from that linear kind of boxed in thinking of putting the arts in this niche and reading and arithmetic in another, that we could allow all of them to kind of play and become creative activities to stimulate the imagination of children.
I'm sure the children would be very happy if we could make these changes. And of course, now we're faced with problems of safety, problems of responsibility, of liability, and all of that,
Well, it strikes me also, I often get the question from my students that um, they feel like they need talent in order to be able to draw. And I tend to tell them, you only think that you don't have a talent in drawing because you've never been taught to draw. If we never taught math in school, people would think that you had to have the math talent to be a mathematician. And I'm very curious, what are your thoughts on this idea of talent?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you've put it exactly, Jessica. We don't teach reading to train up for poets and writers. We teach it because it's a basic skill. And we should be teaching drawing because it's basic to thinking, and not for training up artists. We don't support artists anyway in our culture at the moment, but to train drawing, teach drawing for thinking, to improve thinking, which is what we teach reading for, to improve thinking. That's the goal.
Oh, how wonderful. And so what benefits do you think we would see as a country if we did reinvigorate drawing and arts into education?
Well, certainly we would improve kids' educational experience. Number one. The complaint I have heard from our students was that school was boring.
Yes.
Over and over, was deadly boring to them. So that would be a start. And then the other is, of course, creativity and problem solving. We need those functions of the brain to improve those skills.
Absolutely. And I believe I just heard a statistic that creativity and creative problem solving is one of the most requested skills that companies and businesses are looking for.
So ironic, isn't it?
Isn't it?
But we're talking about early education. A person can learn to draw at any age, which is the great thing. Our oldest student was 85 years old in a 5-day class, and she did great. So drawing can be learned at any age, and aside from the pleasure it gives, it can also improve creativity at any age.
That is so true. I've seen it in my adult students as well, and it's as I personally continue to follow up on what's happening with neuroscience, it's such a relief to know how plastic the brain is and that we really can continue to learn nonstop.
Absolutely, yes.
So I'm curious, what would you say is something that you've seen is one of the biggest enemies of a person learning to draw, of sitting down and trying to have a creative moment, and perhaps like a psychological barrier?
Well, it is what you mentioned, the idea that one has to have artistic talent in order to learn to draw well. And, if we had that idea with reading, that only a gifted writer could learn how to read and write, we'd be in very bad shape, So that's the beginning of it. And then the other thing is that people have not been trained in the basic skills. So just as with reading, they wouldn't be able to read, they aren't able to draw. You need to learn the basic skills. And once learned, they apply to all drawing. We're talking about realistic drawing. And they can go on and enjoy those skills. But it starts there, that a person needs to. Now, those skills are limited in number, I'm happy to say. There are only 5. and they can be learned in 5 days. They're not terribly difficult, really. And once learned, as with reading, there are 5 basic skills of reading, incidentally.
And I'm
not sure I can name them all. The sound of letters, phonics, how the letter sounds are used in words, basic syntax, how a sentence is formed. I've forgotten the 4th. The 5th is comprehension. In drawing, it's the perception of edges, the perception of spaces, the perception of relationships. How big is this compared to that? The perceptions of light, the perception of lights and shadows, and the perception of the what I've called the gestalt, or the whole thing, how it all fits together. So in essence, they are twin skills. 5 skills for drawing, 5 skills for reading.
So
interesting.
Yes, I never considered those parallels, and that's amazing that our brain has those 2 mirrors, just as.
Isn't that interesting? And the thing is that these skills are essential to continuing on to very high level skills, but every skill has its basic skills. Every skill, riding a bike, for example, has its basic skills. So we should be teaching these basic skills. And I think what has prevented is the idea that drawing is talent dependent, as we say, and that there must be dozens, maybe hundreds of skills involved. But that's not the case. And that really is what my book is all about, teaching those 5 basic skills. And then you can go on and elaborate.
And go in so many different directions in the arts, but absolutely, drawing is that foundation.
Drawing is foundational. That is totally recognized throughout the field.
Well, it is such a shame that the main barrier that we have to having more successful creative drawers out there is this active myth that people are putting out that it's impossible to learn.
Yeah.
And that reminds me, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Dr. Brene Brown, but I saw some research. She studies shame and vulnerability, and she recently cited that the vast majority of people have some shaming experience in school, and that half of the people who've had some moment of humiliation had that happen in the arts. And so after this traumatic moment in school where a child is told, you're not good at this, you're not born an artist, often they just stop. And I'm wondering if you've come across.
Oh, yes. So many of our students tell stories like this of the teacher in grade school who holds up their drawing and says, now, children, this is the way not to draw. In one case, the teacher ripped the drawing in half and put it into the wastebasket. Now, that child will never pick up a pencil to draw again, ever. And the fact that they reappear in our class, our workshop, is a miracle, really a miracle. And I've heard story after story similar to that. So there seems to, teachers don't do that with reading usually, but drawing, maybe because the teachers themselves cannot draw, that they pick on that to make fun of kids. And that is a very bad thing to do.
Oh, absolutely. I don't know if you've heard that idea that people tend to be judgmental in areas that they themselves feel the most insecure about.
That's true. Yes, that's interesting. Do you bring that up? Right? I believe that.
Huh. Well, I think it's also a testament to this innate human drive to draw and to make art that, as you said, these students do still come back.
They do show up, yes. Yeah.
And
Yes, it's interesting. Another thing that shows up in our classes is that if someone else in the family is good at drawing, the person will not challenge that. And if they do, these individuals show up in our workshop, they have an especially hard time uh, getting over their lack of self-confidence. And I will say to them, perhaps, does someone in your family draw well? Oh, yes, my sister is marvelous at drawing. And I always envied it, but I could never do it. So this is another of the sort of traps of not being able to draw.
wow. So fascinating. These stories we tell ourselves, and hopefully we can help rewrite that story a little bit.
Oh, I hope so. Yes, I hope so. We do at our workshops. We
Absolutely. Well,
pull them out.
I have seen in practice, I have to say, I'm ever grateful to you because I begin every single one of my beginner drawing classes with your upside down drawing, one of the very first exercises from drawing on the right side of the brain. And I have seen people see their story collapse when they do that drawing. They don't know what they're drawing. I cover the image so they're not able to see as they're drawing along. And when it's finished, they suddenly have this confidence in themselves as artists.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious where that exercise came from.
Well, it happened when I first started teaching. I had a job at Venice High School in LA, teaching art to sophomore kids. And I thought, when I started, I thought, well, I'll teach them how to draw quickly, and then we can get on to the fun stuff. And and to my surprise, I tried teaching them how to draw, and it didn't work. And I would come along and say to them something like, "Can you see that the orange is sitting in front of the vase?" And they would say, "Sure, I can see that." And I would say, "Well, you have them sitting in the same space in your drawing." And the student will say, "Well, I didn't know how to fix that." And so one day I was so frustrated with all this that I came into class. I said, "Today we're drawing upside down." And the students thought I'd gone around the bend. And,
the crazy art teachers.
But they settled down. I gave them actually it was a Picasso drawing, and I told them not to look at it right side up ever, and to copy it upside down. And to our surprise, we hung them up after they were finished. And I said to the students, "How come you can draw upside down, but you can't draw it right side up?" And they said, "We didn't know what we were drawing." Now that was puzzling, really puzzling. And it was about that time that Roger Sperry's work was published on split brain cases, do you recall? That demonstrated that the two hemispheres are doing different things. And it hit me that perhaps that was it, that you had to shift over, quote, shift over to another way of operating if you want to draw. And so I experimented for the students, became interested in all this, and we began to try to work out this problem. And it sure enough worked. And it seemed to me that turning the drawing upside down almost forced the verbal system out of the job. Because upside down, it cannot recognize or name things, and says, in effect, if you're going to do this stuff, I'm out of it. that leaves there, and this is really the model for all of the exercises in my book. The model is to present the brain with a job that the left brain will turn down. So we use negative space. The left hemisphere cannot name those unnameable spaces and says, in effect, if you're going to do that stuff, I'm out of it. Very slow drawing. It does not like that, gets impatient. I'm out of that. Perspective has paradoxical information. How in your drawing, how come the ceiling is drawn at a slant? And that can't be right because I know the ceiling is level. And if you're going to do that stuff, I'm out of it. So that's the model, to present the brain with a job that the left brain will turn down. And that's why when you're drawing, you feel as though you're in a different space, sort of what you were mentioning.
Absolutely. And I think you just named two activities that I get the most resistance from my students. So slow drawing. We recently finished a course following The Natural Way to Draw by Nicolaides.
Oh, yes.
Oh, my goodness, with the slow contour drawing.
Yes, he was brilliant. That book was brilliant, right?
And definitely we had to encourage each other and coach each other on in this course to stay with it and to finish the timer with the single line drawing.
Yes.
But it's especially difficult in this world where we're training ourselves through the smartphones and all the distractions in the world to maintain that patience. So how interesting. And I wonder if there's anything you would say to a student who's struggling with patience in their drawing to help encourage them.
I would say you're under control of your left hemisphere, and just try getting out of it. It's a very pleasant state. So the left hemisphere is very competitive, wants to stay on, wants to stay in charge, does not want to give up its dominance to its silent partner, which is without language, and will fight it. But the trick is that the left brain can be tricked out of the job. And despite its great intelligence, it can be tricked with the same trick over and over again. And that's what the upside down drawing does. So if you want to draw, you just sit down and start. There will be big objections. You should be doing the dishes. You should be calling your mother. You should be, and so on. The left brain trying to bully its silent partner out of the job. If you persist, it will then drop out of the job, and over time it takes less and less time, and leave you to focus really on what you're doing. Learning to draw has a great deal to do with learning to control your own brain to some extent. And we all know the brain is out of control most of the time, does what it wants to do in spite of what we know we should be doing. And learning to draw requires this little bit of training to control your own brain. And that's one of the advantages.
Sounds very much like the sort of meditator's goal of silencing that voice of the ego and entering a more silent flow.
Yes, exactly so. And philosophers over time have proposed so many different ways of trying to control the brain. The left brain is terribly useful, but it's a sort of bully, let's face it. It's a sort of bully, and it needs countering, at least. I don't want to, I'm trying not to insult my own friend, which is listening to this.
Yes, we've got to be
nice. You really, you benefit in many ways from learning to draw.
Mm. Well, that's interesting. This reminds me, going back to our earlier conversation about that bullying comparative part of the left side of the brain, and how that also is how we're teaching kids in schools, and that sense of perfectionism. And when we have the left side of the brain being the only one that's catered to, and only that linear sort of multiple test type of thinking that's taught, it reminds me of the difficulty of grading, and whether it be in schools or a specific drawing or grading, or really the word for it, I think, should be evaluation. How can we evaluate our artwork, or in really whatever field, that isn't quite so left-brained? And
yes, so punitive, really, or comparison with other people. I had, when I was teaching at the university, I had big problems over the grading. But I finally convinced them that it was most fair to grade each student on their progress, rather than grading each student against all the other kids in the class. And that the university finally allowed me. It was a big fight, actually.
Wow!
But they finally allowed me to do that, and the students were quite accepting of that, and saw grading as useful rather than punitive, which is what it should be, but it's generally punitive.
Unfortunately, so. And
you're lucky in your classes you don't have to grade.
Yes. Yeah, we're definitely looking for progress over perfection. But what I aim for, at least in my classes, is to help students gain a skill of looking at their artwork and learning over time how to think more critically or intelligently about it than simply to say, "Oh, it's terrible, I want to throw it away." And what questions would you have a student ask whenever they finish a drawing that could help them improve in the next iteration of that drawing?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure I've ever really thought about that, Jessica. I think we usually try to have students say what they like about the drawing and what they don't like, or if there's something they think needs improving. But I haven't really addressed that question. That's an interesting question, and I would have to think about that, I think. How do you do that? What do you do?
So I tend to have my students look down a list of the elements of art: value, line, it's different uses of their technique. And when they find something that they don't like about a drawing, to begin to learn to use their artistic vocabulary in order to say, it's not that this is a terrible drawing, but my value scale was much too light. So
that's interesting, right?
And so to use that as a springboard so that they specifically focus on that in their next drawing as something to improve.
Yes, I think that must be very helpful. Did the students respond to that?
So far, the challenge tends to be, and I think it's actually an interesting interweaving of that left and right brain, where the goal is to continue to use that art vocabulary so that they know what it means to have a variety of line quality, or to be more aware of the negative spaces in the drawing. So it's always a work in progress.
Of course, right. Good idea, though. Very good idea.
Well, thank you so much. Now, I was curious, you are well known for your art books. How do you find the creative process of writing compared to the process of creating drawings and artwork?
It's extremely painful because the right hemisphere processes don't translate very well to words. And so if you're writing about something like drawing, I can remember working on all of the editions of the books, knowing in a global sense what I want to say, and then trying to find the words to put that into words. And that is difficult and not fun.
Well,
it just is not fun. You know, I hear people say, writers who say, oh, I love to write. I just can't wait to get back to what I'm working on. And so I look at them and I wonder what they could be talking about. Because to me, writing is much more difficult.
Well, you had a particularly daunting task in front of you to translate this nonverbal skill into words. So thank you for your service and sacrifice of those painful hours, because I think you are one of the most eloquent writers of our time on how to take that visual world and translate.
Oh, that's a wonderful compliment. Thank you so much. I would sit there at the computer and say to myself, just say it, Betty. Oh, it's very funny. I have an idea for a new small book, and I just cannot muster the discipline to really get it done. So,
and what book would that be?
Well, I just have a couple of ideas that are interesting to me that I think I could work out if I would write the book, you know, that I don't quite understand. One having to do with idness, which I is dominant.
Idness. Oh, interesting.
Right, and the implications of that. And then also just to do a little bit of a memoir. I'm not much on memoirs, but to do that. But whether this will ever get done, I don't know.
Do you have a favorite art education book yourself, or?
Oh, Nicolaitis is the book. Definitely, yeah. He was brilliant, you know, for his time, and he did not have the advantage of the split brain, the brain studies, you know. But it was purely intuitive and brilliant, really brilliant.
Absolutely. Well, I am just so grateful that you've been able to take the time to speak with me today, and I'm excited to continue to follow your book and your exercises and share them with my students. And we're all so grateful for your insights into drawing and arts education and how they are still creating value for those who take the time to learn every day. So thank you, Betty.
Well, it's for me to thank you, Jessica, and your students are very lucky. You are doing nothing but good for them. Learning to draw, it never harms. It always helps. So you should be proud of what you're doing. And it's been a great pleasure to meet you today. Thank you so much.
Same. Thank you, Betty.